Dear Mr. McDonald, I have a complaint about this book. It's unrealistic. Raccoons are not productive. The rest is pretty fine, though. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we'll be continuing our stroll through the works of Ian MacDonald with the second novel in publication order, and that is Out on Blue 6 from 1989. We'll be talking about all of it in the usual way. I'll give you a quick synopsis, tell you why you should go and read the book if you can find it, and then we'll talk about some more nuanced stuff that will involve spoilers. Yeah, that's that. Also, I might be running a slight fever, which will definitely help make this more coherent. Trust me, this makes sense. Anyway, let's get started, right? Alright, Out on Blue 6 is a standalone novel. It is maybe cyberpunkish, it is maybe science fiction-ish, it is maybe a lot of crazy, and very interesting in that regard. I really enjoyed it, but it can be somewhat overwhelming, so please keep that in mind. I think you should go and read it because it is like nothing you have ever read before and will ever read again, trust me in that. It does, however, involve a lot of different elements, a lot of references, a lot of desperate like changes in style, all of these things, and they can be jarring if you're not used to that kind of reading. So open your mind, I don't know, take some don't do that, do whatever you need to open your mind, and let's just experience this incredible roller coaster of just about everything that can be thrown at a book and made to stick in one go. It is, as I said, highly interesting. It is wonderful. It's imaginative beyond belief. It is funny as hell. If you get, you'll get some of the jokes, trust me. It does have deeper meanings and themes and so forth as well, and it's just one of the craziest rides I've had in a long time with reading a book, and that's good, right? There's this famous quote from, well, not famous quote, but like Cory Doctorow wrote a foreword for like the latest re-release, edition from like 2014 and called it a 16-car pileup in Dr. Seuss country. That's maybe an understatement. So yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about here. I think you should definitely go and read it if you want to try something really, really weird. And once again, this is pushing the envelope of what fantasy or fantastical science fiction can do. Sometimes it's overshooting the mark, but that's also part of like how we, move forward with like literary genres. So that's worth it. Trust me. You will not regret this. You may need some time to calm down afterwards, though. So that's why I think you should read it. It follows different people. It has two main plot lines of a cartoonist living in the compassionate society and an artist that does more like performance art stuff. And they go on different journeys that bring them up against the system, and yeah, that's basically it. There are interspersed some other parts that sort of bind those two narratives together, and beyond that, it's sci-fi madness in the wildest way imaginable, and yeah. So go check it out if you can find it somewhere. I highly recommend you do that, because I need more people to talk about this. It's just this wild. And while you do that, it's not that long, you can do it. I'll have a bit of beer, and then we'll talk about a lot of other stuff that is in this book, and it will involve spoilers, so yeah. All right, you're back. I hope you've read the book. How do you like the raccoons? And let's talk about some of the things that we're trying to do here. First of all, this is, as I said, a series of videos where we'll talk about all the works of Ian MacDonald and sort of see how an artist evolves over time with their art and their concerns and so forth. And I think after the first one, Desolation Road, Out on Blue 6 does show up with a number of concerns and themes that will come up in later Ian MacDonald books again and again and again. In sometimes all of them together, sometimes only some of them, but it introduces some more key sort of like concerns of MacDonald's work. And in this book, they all are in there, and they overlap, and they kind of clash sometimes, which can lead to this book kind of feeling a bit too much from time to time. I think that there are more reasons why this is the case, but yeah, ideas about artificial intelligence, the relationship between artificial intelligence and humanity is one of those. There's other parts here that we can see later on the influence of art on, revolution, on society and so forth. All of these bits and pieces come up again and again, and we'll point them out when we talk about these different later books when we come there. But yeah, this is very much all in here, and it is very kaleidoscopic and all over the place in some situations. And yeah, let's look at why this may be the case. And I think beyond, that this being like his second big novel, and artists sometimes trying really hard with like a first or second book, and McDonald has said in like one really old interview that he doesn't like the book. I don't know if he feels the same now that it's like, 30 years after that interview, but I can see that it can feel like he's trying too hard to himself. I don't know if that's still the case, but I can see where that idea comes from. Now let's look at why I think there are reasons this is a case beyond just, it being a second book of a young artist that is still trying to, impress people. Let's talk about the context. This is the late 1980s. This came out in 1989, and that's a very interesting time in history and literature and art, philosophy, and so forth. It's the end of the Cold War. That's the first part. It's what some people call the end of history. We'll come back to that. In that famous Fukuyama thing that has aged so incredibly well. It is also the height of the biggest hype of postmodern philosophy or postmodernism as a movement. And we'll come back to that later as well, because I think these bits and pieces are important. It is also sort of the tail end of the first era of cyberpunk, with like the cyberpunk movement starting mostly in the late 70s, early 80s, being very much an 80s kind of wave within science fiction literature. We're at the tail end of that. This is the era of Snow Crash coming out like I think a year later or so. This is the era where cyberpunk moves on into weirder, wilder, and more over-the-top kind of places in a lot of ways. And has been around long enough for it to become self-referential or become another part, or to be referenced and used and subverted and so forth. This is where cyberpunk begins to sort of like switch over into post-cyberpunk almost. All of these elements, I think, are important to understanding this book in a lot of ways, and why it is the crazy thing that it is. Interestingly enough, Frederick Jameson, as a literary critic and cultural critic, has mentioned or made the bold statement that Neuromancer and cyberpunk are the quintessential postmodern novel and postmodern genre. And I think we can see this sort of reflected here in a lot of ways. I'm not arguing this is a full-on criticism of postmodernism, but it does certainly try to engage with that specific sort of way of doing culture, with that way of engaging with the world, and the possible problems that may lie in this. So that's like the first big part here that I think explains why there is so much going on here, because it was a time where a lot of things were going on all at the same time. We have like the end of an era. Everyone feels it's the end of an era. There's sort of a bit of like techno optimism in a lot of ways. Like, yep, technology may actually become good and save the world in a lot of ways. We have all of that sort of clashing at the same time. And I feel that Autumn Blue 6 is in some ways sort of reacting to that and infused by that very specific confusing moment in time. So some of the confusion may just be a result of when it was made, also a result of like the tools that it was using. That's the first part that we need to talk about. Now let's talk about how these things sort of manifest. Let's begin with the compassionate society, or you. Now, throughout this, I will be referencing other science fiction books because I think, and movies and stuff, and I think that's important because they definitely come up from time to time and very explicitly, sometimes less explicitly, but, you know, using different references to art and pieces and piecing them together is part of the postmodern approach to art. Once again, it's bricolage. And McDonald does use that in a lot of ways. So we have the compassionate society, which is clearly a reference or subversion in a lot of ways of the authoritarian system of, say, a book like 1984. We have the love police, we have the Ministry of Pain. All of these terminologies sound very, very Orwellian in a specific way, but they are switched in in other ways, because where Orwell uses words in like opposite ways, this is not exactly the same thing. Which is why we need to introduce another concept, that being, of course, the spectacle. Sorry, this is going to be a very artsy kind of conversation for all kinds of reasons. We'll come back to that later. So, the spectacle, as introduced by the Situationist International, sometimes earlier and later, is the idea that we have built us a bit of a, well, the world is a system, is a structure, the spectacle, that creates the image of what it is. It's all-encompassing, and it is not exactly the things itself, it's just the image of the things that we are looking forward. And it is very much about consumption in a lot of ways, or consumption of images at this point, only of spectacles. And the compassionate society does very much go down that route, right? It's about the avoidance of any form of pain, numbing that pain by doing the things that are at least lukewarm, enjoyable for a moment. It doesn't tax anyone in any possible way, because pain will lead to dissatisfaction, which can lead to change. And the compassionate society does do that, not by heavily suppressing anyone who might dissent and having everyone else live in, like, I don't know, misery. When you look back to something like 1984, obviously, life in that book and that world is not exactly beautiful, even for the people that are, you know, adhering to every rule of the system. Whereas if you are with the compassionate society, you have a pretty good life here. And that's sort of the difference here, where I think concepts like the spectacle come in. Now, the important part here is, once again, there are differences here. The compassionate society does not actually evolve. It is static. It has stagnated in a lot of ways, which you can read if you want as sort of, you know, the end of history. History has ended. I think it's, I dimly remember that actually being an actual line within the book. So history has stopped. At some point, people are just basically in this, like, parking loop, mostly enjoying their lives, and so forth. And that's something that needs to change, maybe. And we'll talk about all of that. Which brings me to the next part, art. See, a lot of this book is about art as a tool to break that all-encompassing hold of the compassionate society, of the spectacle, which is certainly something that other people have tried before. I mentioned the Situationist International before, which was a group of, loosely affiliated group of artists, activists, and so forth, building theory and doing performance arts and other things that may be considered guerrilla art, or even, you know, resistance in a lot of ways, to break the hold of the spectacle, to break it in and move society forward into a new future that is ideally better. And when we look at the Raging Apostles, in particular, as a group here, they are, like, even when we have conversations between Kansas Burn and Kilimanjaro West, we have certain discourses feel very, very similar to stuff that went on in that specific movement that, you know, ended up leading to the 1968 general strike and upheavals in France and so forth. And yeah, the idea there is that, like, art is one way of sort of breaking the spell, breaking that hold of the spectacle, of that consensus reality, of that compassionate society. And I feel that is sort of one way of looking at it. We also have, obviously, the lone artist who tries something rebellious, that being Courtney Hall, doing her cartoons, her satires, and satire being obviously forbidden as a non-constructive criticism, which is an interesting way of looking at satire, but, you know, she has to flee and she goes on her hero's journey. And this is where we come to the next interesting part, and that being another reference that we find here to another science fiction book. That, of course, not being a book, but mostly a movie that you may have seen. Have you ever heard of Logan's Run? Yes, someone leaving a underground society, going out on the world, into the world, having an adventure and so forth. It's a classic science fiction movie, and Courtney's journey through the underworld, meeting Jonathan, the Racoons, and so forth, coming out and, you know, seeing that there's a world out there which is absolutely ruined and so forth, is one way of looking at that, and going on what you might call an inverted hero's journey, because she starts underground and has to go out in the outside world and come back underground with the knowledge of what is out there. Once again, a lot of this is about subversion, using different elements and piecing them together in new and interesting ways. And yeah, that's one of those. Also, Jonathan Mnemonius, you ever read Johnny Mnemonic? I think there might be references to other older cyberpunk books in here, the cyberpunk text, and that's something we'll come back to later. But I already mentioned that at the point this book is written, cyberpunk as a genre is established enough to become sort of fodder for the postmodern bricolage of everything goes. So that's one big sector that we find here. The idea of having, you know, totalitarian societies, all-encompassing societies, and the way that art can be one way of breaking that open, giving people a chance to, find ways to make sense of the world and hopefully find a way into a new world. Remember that even in Hopeland, McDonald's last book, at this point still last book from 2023, was very much artists are still a key part of that world. So yeah, that's the first part. Now let's talk about the next big theme: AI, Christianity, and so forth. Because obviously, the compassionate society is ruled by a group of gods, which are obviously artificial intelligences that have evolved and have taken over life because humanity was at the point of destroying itself. Once again, this is a theme that will come up in later books. I'll point it out when it happens. And the idea of tying it to Christianity in a lot of ways is also interesting, because what we see here is, of course, that the story of Kilimanjaro West being basically the child of God, or the child of gods, that being an artificial intelligence, coming down to Earth, to you, and finding out what it means to be human, to then have humanity judged. Yeah, that's the core Christian story. And there's a wrinkle to it, of course, and we'll come to that in a second. But having that idea of creator and created being inverted, humanity developing artificial intelligence, outstripping humanity, and being beneficial rulers, or maybe something other, is certainly a concern that has been around for a while. We see parts of that in all the way back to Neuromancer and much, much, much earlier. We also have the darker side of that in, this is the time when terrible people like Dan Simmons write books like Hyperion, which are all about how AIs are evil. Here, artificial intelligence is clearly beneficial. And this leads to something interesting, because it leads to the idea of, like, who is developing here? And it's like, does the development of artificial intelligence prevent the further development of humanity, which is currently the case when this book starts. And we'll see where that leads later on, when it is, of course, artificial intelligence's determining that humanity has grown enough to handle its own sort of fate again, and artificial intelligences just fuck off into space, which, as you may remember, is the end of, spoiler, the Sprawl trilogy by William Gibson, when, Wintermute and some others fuck off to talk to other intelligences somewhere in space. And so we have that idea of, development, helping each other to grow, and then going their own ways. This also will come up later in other books. So another key concern here. The third part is, of course, the circularity. See, Kilimanjaro West is not the first advocate that gets, embodied and has to find out if humanity is good enough. This is the, I don't know if we actually get the number, but the point is, this happens again and again and again in cycles, as if artificial intelligences are running the same program again and again. Dare I call it a simulation? Possibly not. But once again, the idea that history moves in cycles, but maybe we can break out of these cycles into another place afterwards, is also something that may come up later in later books. I'll talk about it maybe, I don't know, if we talk about Brazil or something. We will see. So we have this third, big concern here. One being a totalitarian society, but one that appears to be beneficial in the beginning. The spectacle and so forth, and the idea of how to break out of this all-encompassing system, possibly through art and other ways of finding out who we really are, of taking risks, of accepting pain as a necessary part of the human condition. That is one part. Then the idea of developing artificial intelligence, having a relationship to other creatures that are more powerful than we are, or that we have created, or on the other hand, We have obviously the Racoons that are sort of uplifted and behaving responsible to those kind of people. The idea of responsibility, if we have differences in what you might call ability, power, or whatever, right? That's the second part, the second big theme. The third part being about history repeating itself and the idea of how to break out of these cycles possibly. These are three key concerns that come up in this book again and again and again, and they come up in later Ian McDonald books as well. Now, the point is, all of them are happening all at once in this book, which can lead to, what you might call sensory overload. And this is sort of where feel that we need to go back. Because see, sensory overload can be a tactic. Sensory overload can be one tactic of breaking, one strategy of breaking that hold that our current consensus reality has on us. It's a strategy that someone like Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea use in the Illuminatus trilogy in some ways. It's something that is part of postmodernism, which is all about the confusion of meanings, or the meaninglessness of meanings and so forth, which does then use the idea of bricolage, of taking different elements and rearranging them and creating a new reality through that, which is exactly what McDonald does here. The problem is, of course, if you do this too much and if you pick your bits from too far all over the place, it can feel pretentious. That's a thin line to walk, and it's also one that depends on who you are as a reader, as a connoisseur of art or whatever. I had a lot of fun with this. I recognized, or thought I recognized, a lot of people, things and bits and pieces that all have meaning to me, because I've read a lot of cyberpunk. So when I see the King of Nebraska and I read the name Jonathan Mnemonius, I think Johnny Mnemonic and William Gibson reference. On the other hand, maybe someone else does not. When we have a sentence like Courtney Hall's worries multiplied with Malthusian vigor, I start giggling madly, because that's like a wonderful simile that would never have thought of, and that's brilliant. Then someone else might think that is incredibly overdone, and there's way more elements in here all over the place. There's jokes about Walt Disney. There's raccoons, an army of raccoons leading the king of Nebraska to the edge of the world. We have all of these elements coming together, and it does create that sensory overload. And if you go out of that afterwards and realize that your world has changed, that you are seeing the world in different ways, that you are aware of the fact that there may be cracks in this all-encompassing world that the system that we've created around it, the spectacle does not actually encompass everything, then it has worked. If you go like, I have no idea what this shit means, then it hasn't worked, and you feel that it is pretentious, and that's where art can actually fail. And I can understand how someone like McDonald could go a couple of years later, it's like, well, I probably leaned too far into the pretentious side of things, and maybe a lot of people didn't get it because it was just too much in a lot of ways. So that's one thing that I feel is interesting to see, and maybe taking some of these concerns. Transhumanism is obviously another concern that we see here in like different approaches of transhumanism, of humans trying to better themselves on the one hand, and on the other hand, computers trying to create better people that can feel no pain, and the question of whether that makes them more human or not. Having all of these elements in here are concerns that will come up in later McDonald books. So, what does that tell us? It's maybe everything all at once, and that can be hard to decipher. I think it also shows it's a snapshot of a specific point in time where all of these concerns came sort of to a head in a lot of ways, and it's interesting to see the solution here. The solution obviously being, we need to take risks. We need to accept the fact that taking risks and taking our own fate in our own hands can lead to disaster. It can lead to all kinds of terrible things. But we need to decide. We can't trust the system, the government. We can't trust the beneficial artificial intelligences built by the biggest corporations of the world. We can't trust these things. It's humans who need to decide this. And if we do that, then we have a bright future, because otherwise history will stagnate. We need to actually move forward, take these risks, which I think is interesting. And when we see how this ends with the habitats moving out into space, which wonderfully, I feel, prefigures something that we see in, say, Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota series, with the last book being called Perhaps the Stars. And that's exactly it. Perhaps we'll get to the stars. Just maybe. And I found that very interesting and very moving. I can see how it maybe just be too much. But on the other hand, you can also just like read this book and just giggle madly whenever you recognize something insane. Look at these different shifts in style when we have a play, when we have a sports reporter talking about a weird ball game, with all of these wonderful bits and pieces that are just like playing for the sake of playing. I don't know where to go with all of this. I think I love the book. It was just a wild ride. I think it is interesting to see as a keystone of McDonald's writing career, of where things will go later on, because it showcases most of his main concerns about ecology, about, you know, society, artificial intelligences, possible cycles repeating themselves. The idea of colonialism is not so heavily built into this here, but we'll get back to that one in, you know, the next book. So yeah, a key text, not necessarily an easy read, but nevertheless, I feel it helps reading it also just to see what was possible, what, you know, bits and pieces that we may only find later in, you know, people like China Miéville or Jeff Vandermeer just fucking around with the craziness of imagination. And that's like the one thing that you can't take away from Out on Blue 6. It's complete and utter wildness and imagination. And I love that. Anyway, that's all I have about Out on Blue 6. What a fucking monster of a book. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you've read it. If you have, let me know what you thought about it. If you have not, and still watched this to the end, let me know what you thought about all my ramblings. Have I successfully kept you away from ever trying it? If so, don't listen to me. Read it anyway. Yeah, that's all of it. I don't know, like, subscribe, talk to me in the comments. There's a Patreon if you feel like it. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one when we talk about something different. And until then, thanks and cheers.